Chapter 2. The Willow Lake Group. Alright, before we go on, I'd like to tell you about the Willow Lake Bookstore and their group. A writing group started by the proprietor, William Heathcote. William was a great man and one of my closest friends. I met him later in life, not long after I arrived at Willow Lake. At the time he was 68 years old, but didn't look a day over 55. Larger than life with a shock of messy gray hair, he looked like a kinder version of Ludwig von Beethoven and was just as talented in the realm of literature. He had a deep yet soft voice that cracked whenever he spoke of Marie, his dearly departed wife. When they had first settled in Willow Lake at the ripe old age of 21, they'd had just enough money to pay for their first month's rent and food. With no prospects apart from their combined literary wit and can-do attitude, they raised enough interest from the locals in the bank to start their own bookstore. It wasn't long before they'd paid off their debts and became the hub of the artistic community, forming the Willow Lake Group, along the lines of Virginia Woolf's Bloomsbury Group. From what the others told me, William worshipped Marie like a queen. According to Beth, one of the group's members, Marie was beautiful, intelligent, articulate, and compassionate to a fault. Beth also told me, to illustrate Marie's kindness, that she once saw her scoop up a large cicada that had been slightly injured, then place it under a tree. Apparently, she stayed by the cicada until it flew off, which was at least 20 minutes later. 7 years prior to my arrival, Marie had been escorted quickly to her grave by pancreatic cancer. Both William and Marie were unaware of the disease, and apart from some abdominal pain and the fact that Marie never complained, everyone thought she was fine. It was in the final stages, when her skin turned yellow and she lost a dramatic amount of weight, that William took her to the hospital under quiet protest. They were both shocked by the discovery and clung to each other for dear life. He nursed her at home, and she didn't want any of the treatments. Sondra and the others brought food which remained untouched, at least by Marie, until William found her one morning sitting in her rocking chair on the front porch of the bookstore, stone cold. He mourned hard and spent most of his time at home, while Sondra and the others took care of the store. It was Sondra who eventually talked him back into spending time in the store, and soon he opened his doors to the Willow Lake Group again, after having shut them when Marie passed away 8 months prior. The rest of the group had been whittled down over the years, leaving the original core, which made William happy. He explained to me that it was strange how no one new stayed long. The new members usually buffeted about like moths around a light bulb before heading off to their destinies. No one stayed in Willow Lake long unless they were a certain type. There are a lot of sleepy towns around the world where people drift in like seeds distributed by the wind. Some take root if they are aligned with the way of life and grow accustomed to the climate and culture, but most become restless and move on. I never thought I would stay in Willow Lake. Like many other places I'd visited, I assumed that I would complete my work and drag my anchor to another town. That was before I met Sondra and realized for the first time in my life that I was home. It was the people as much as the town itself. William told me how many hipster types had arrived over the years, stating loudly to anyone who'd listen that they'd chucked it all in to start afresh. Many opened what they called artisan stores, selling basic foods with fancy names to a community that was already producing good whole food products and folk art. He said it was hilarious to read their blogs, if you were inclined to do so, where they wafted on about their adventures and how they were hoping to change the world, or at least the town. It was apparently even more hilarious when, once they'd realized that they were not the toast of the town, and had only garnered up to 100 followers, all from elsewhere, that they were going broke and up to their ears in debt. Then they'd pack up and scramble back to the city, so happy to turn their backs on a town they once described with words such as magical or warm and inviting. The words soon morphed into backwards, cold and isolated, or even hostile. Willow Lake is indeed magical. It is also isolated, sometimes backwards, but never hostile. When I say backwards, I mean it in the nicest way possible. It's not that they don't keep up with the times. It's more to the point that they're unlikely to be suckered into fads or caring too much about popular culture. They keep on the way they always kept on, calm, down to earth, and wise beyond the years of the town's existence. I fell in love with the sugar maples, the fishing, the annual Willow Lake Berry Festival, and the old-time rustic feel of a town that remained unspoiled by cheap technology. I'd already seen it all by the time I arrived, at the age of 42. It didn't take me long to fall for Sondra, too, but more of that later. The other members of the original core of the Willow Lake Group were a peculiar mix of people, who were all literary in one way or another. Apart from William, who was a big lover of philosophy and the Bohemian movement, there were 3 women and 2 men. The group had started in the early 70s, with Stanley and April signing up as the first 2 members on the same day, one particularly hot July. When I met Stanley, he was 52, determinedly debonair, as thin as a rail, and deeply closeted. When I say deeply closeted, of course I mean gay, but he would never admit it. He never did to anyone, and I wonder if he ever did to himself. He was so openly flamboyant, priggish, and carried on like an English governess when around attractive men. He also wore his heart on his sleeve, so he was easily bruised and hilariously theatrical, therefore endearing himself to everyone who met him. He parted his short, light brown hair in the middle, having dyed the grays away, and wasn't averse to a hint of makeup every now and then. He was a lover of the theater and would often break out into a chorus or short soliloquy. He loved writing farcical plays as well as dramatic poetry. I remember him always trying to set up his own theater company, but it never went any further than fantasy. April was 49, a Chinese-American woman who was so delicate and quiet. I thought that the sound of the telephone ringing would shred her to pieces until I got to know her. She was refined yet strangely earthy, gentle yet resilient and willful, beautifully ethereal yet solid and utilitarian. She was always neat and tidy, with her simple black skirts and crisp white shirts. It was like a uniform, complete with her unassuming black shoes. She looked like a wallflower or a one-dimensional being, but sometimes her loose bun and stray hair gave her away. Of course, she was so much more, but when I first met her I thought that I'd been introduced to a shadow or a wisp of smoke. She was into philosophy, feng shui, and Zen Buddhism. She wrote philosophical poetry, owned 5 cats, and had once spent a whole year in bed due to depression. She wouldn't tell why or what the circumstances were. She was perpetually intriguing. Stanley and April had been with the Willow Lake Group since the beginning, and had always been considered unlikely friends since they were teenagers. April was the rock of Gibraltar that Stanley slammed himself against in order to try and break the vessel to free his spirit. It was, we thought at the time, never freed, and, surprisingly, April was able to take it. It was almost like she needed it in order to prove her worthiness to herself. She was always there for Stanley when it was all too much. She was like a vault. She would never tell anyone what happened in their conversations, and protected Stanley like a mother, even though she was slightly younger. He returned the favor by being aggressively protective of her. No one could even roll their eyes over April in the presence of Stanley, not that anyone was ever afforded the opportunity to do so. He often called her my concubine or my little oyster, and fussed over her when she came into the room. It was adorable the way she would pretend to dislike the attention from Stanley, when her secret smile, tiny giggle, and single finger to the middle of her lips gave her away. I loved them both. I loved them all, and still do. Particularly Alan, who was a 57-year-old bear of a man. He reminded me of Hemingway, with his love of fishing, women, and booze. He had unruly salt and pepper hair, heavy on the salt, which he slicked back with pomade. He was always in khaki and liked going barefoot. I liked him instantly, as he was the kind of man who could be garrulous and gentle in the same 60 seconds. His heart would melt over a kitten, then harden into a fist if one of his friends was hurt. Everything he did and said was catapulted in a ball of passion, laughter, and rage. Women swooned around him, men flocked to him. It was his charisma and the fact that he had the best stories and was entirely generous. When he returned from his various jaunts around the world, funded by his sporadic fishing jobs and many admirers, everyone would gather round to hear about his experiences. I got along well with him because we shared an admiration for the Beat generation, especially Burroughs, Ginsberg, and Kerouac. Alan loved travel writing, but had never been published. He could never get his act together and gather them in some kind of order. Everyone had offered to help at various stages, but William told me that if they were ever published, Alan would have had to stop the embellishments. Another thing we had in common was our checkered pasts. Alan had been incarcerated in many countries and had the scars and tattoos to prove it. If you haven't already noticed, I'm leaving Sondra till last, not that it denotes any lower level of importance attributed to her. Just the opposite, actually. You always have to save the best till last. The final two members, before Sondra, were Beth and Delia. I mention them together for a reason, as they were lovers. However, they were as different as chalk and cheese. Beth was Buddha incarnate, serenity always. I really do believe that in a major world crisis like a zombie apocalypse or an alien invasion, Beth would be the only one not panicked. Everything she did and said was philosophical. I felt the stress leaving my body whenever she entered the room, and loved her warm, sincere hugs. She was 55 years old, African-American, voluptuous, and omnipotent. She worked at the Willow Lake Community School where she taught poetry, and where Delia worked as a social worker. Delia was a human squirrel, a tall, bright, and bubbly squirrel. I'd always thought that energy levels were matched with the bodies that contained them. For example, small birds are lightning fast in their movements, and elephants are slow. Delia blasted that theory out of the water. Her short white hair was a pixie cut, which suited her 51 years nicely. She wore a lot of flowing corals and pastels, decorated with Native American jewelry. She was a quirky chatterbox, fascinated by everything and everyone. We all found her hilarious physicality intoxicating. She would burst into the room, spilling over with enthusiasm and jostling her bangled arms for emphasis. She loved Native American mythology, women's rights, fantasy novels, and metaphysical pursuits. She could write a novel in a weekend, most of them fantasy or spirituality, and had a rapid-fire intellect that never let up. I found it amazing that the two women had anything in common, being almost polar opposites. What's that saying? They completed each other. Sounds kooky, but they really did. Beth had been married before, with no children. However, she divorced in her early 30s and met Delia when she was 35. They'd stayed together ever since. Delia also had a failed marriage behind her, as she got married in her late teens and divorced when she hit 21. She'd always known that she preferred women, but due to the times had kept it a secret, until she met Beth. The interesting thing about Willow Lake was that no one cared much about people's sexual orientation or religious persuasion. That was one of the things that hooked me in. Not that I'm a shirt-lifter or turbo-atheist. Mind you, I appreciate both, and have always had friends from all walks of life and all ages. Now we're at the part where I introduce Mina, seeing as I'm about to tell you how Liam found the bookstore, chasing the owner of the golden handwriting. Mina arrived late in the piece, and by the time Liam turned up, she'd only been in Willow Lake for 7 weeks. My God, what a space cadet. She had the left side of her head shaved, and the right side was long, just past her small bosoms, always dyed a vulgar shade of red. Her ears were pierced multiple times, and she also had both nostrils pierced, with 2 jade loops that always looked like circles of snot to me, but what do I know? She wore tons of makeup, which was sad because she was actually quite a looker. Her clothes alternated from manga space queen to derelict punk, depending on her moods, which swung at the drop of a hat. Her heart was in the right place at the ripe old age of 20. Her voice was annoyingly high-pitched, like a woman trying to pretend she's still 5 years old. It would have been easy to dismiss such a mess. However, I found her strangely fascinating. She was a mix of elven, boho, and alien, quite childish, but wise at the same time. She was heavily into veganism and conspiracy theories. You would see her swilling wheatgrass juice like mother's milk behind the register at the bookstore. When she turned up to work, as she enjoyed going mushrooming, if you know what I mean. I liked her haphazard activism and the fact that she'd overcome some heavy molestation up until the age of 14. She was quite open about it and treated it like it was no big deal. Of course, it was a big deal for the rest of us, but she would not accept sympathy for it. That was one part of her life that she already had sorted, which is ironic because the rest of her life was chaotic to say the least. I could say she was ferociously crazy, yet it was tempered by her deep well of compassion for every sentient being. Now, my lady, Sondra. Keep in mind that I'd been a drifter for most of my young life, up until then. My size and inability to stay away from trouble when I was younger saw me getting into the seedy part of life, without actually being an addict or pusher. You see, I'd always fought other people's battles when I was at school, so it was a natural progression for me to become a hired goon for the local drug dealers. Being 6'4" and built like a brick shithouse made it easy for me to find work, but it wasn't until Kara, my then-girlfriend, had a miscarriage that I was sent into a downward spiral. We split up and I drifted away from the gangs, traveling around and working as a carpenter. One night I had too much to drink at a local tavern and saw a big guy picking on a smaller guy. I couldn't help myself. I charged over and started bashing into the bastard without trying to break it up or find out what the beef was over. Before I knew it, I was hauled off by the cops and the bastard was in the hospital in critical care. When I woke up the next morning hungover and facing a 5-year sentence, I sobered up good and proper. I was lucky to do 3 years, even though the bastard had nearly lost an eye and was missing 6 teeth from his broken jaw. It turned out that the bastard was an angry father confronting the rock spider who'd molested his 9-year-old daughter. I was the laughingstock of the prison, but it soon wore off. Then it was all I could do to avoid the gang leader's job offers, to provide protection. I wanted to clean up my act and fly straight. Once out of prison, I had to stay with my father for a while to complete my parole and prove that I wasn't a menace. As soon as I was clear, I started traveling again, doing carpentry work wherever I could find it. I'm telling you all this to show how I was a moron when I was younger, but I learned from my mistakes. I could never find Kara, not that I was supposed to be looking her up. I sorely missed female company, but didn't want to hook up with some barfly who'd probably put me back in the slammer. By the time I came to Willow Lake, I was virtually a virgin again. I was not expecting my heart to burst into flames, which it did, the night I met Sondra. I'm not telling you about that until a little later, but I will tell you what kind of woman she was, and still is. She was 40 years old at the time, and everything about her was breathtaking. Her voice was like sugary smoke, and her long blonde hair, which hung in gentle ringlets down to her waist, shone like white gold. She was tall and voluptuous, a maddening combination if you ask me. Her green eyes and lovely temperament made you want to sink into her forever. Such a sweet, gentle, yet passionate soul. There was nothing vapid, vacuous, or banal about her. In tune with nature, quiet and mysterious. Just looking at her made you want to fall at her feet and weep sorrowful tears. That sounds like a lot of malarkey, but I'm telling you, this description doesn't even hold a candle to how wonderful this woman was and is. She wore a lot of Indian cotton dresses and smelled like honeyed heaven. She'd never married and had inherited her lovely house from a distant uncle, so she was able to only work part-time while she followed her passion for nature, photography, and, lucky for me, cooking. Boy, can that woman cook. When I met her, she was doing all the cooking for the Willow Lake Group meetings, and it was the main reason I joined, apart from the fact that I just had to get close to her. It's funny, thinking of it now, that I never became enamored with her handwriting like Liam did. When it first happened, I felt like I'd missed something, and that there was some chance that I could lose her to him. We met Sondra at the same time. I can say now that Liam fell in love with the idea of her, leaving the actual woman for me. Lucky me.